Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Winter Show. We're delighted to have you here for this year's edition of America's leading art, antiques, and design show. As many of you know, the Winter Show is not just a celebration of exceptional art and craftsmanship. It's also a benefit for Eastside House Settlement, a service organization that was founded on the Upper East Side in 1891. Today, Eastside House services over 14,000 people annually, and we work to provide education and workforce development. All proceeds from the Winter Show benefit directly Eastside House's life-changing program. So thank you all so much for your support and being here with us today. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's panel discussion, The Beauty of Restraint, Paris and the Empresses of Design, which we are thrilled to present in partnership with our media partner, Airmail. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Laura Jacobs.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Jacobs, and this panel is called The Beauty of Restraint, Paris and the Empresses of Design. One of the things I learned writing for Graydon Carter's Vanity Fair, where I worked from 1995 to 2018, was that information is generational. Put another way, each generation has its own concerns and is ready to see a subject differently than before. I was hired to write profiles about American mid-century designers, and after reading everything that had been written about, say, Charles James or Norman Norell or Mambochet, it became clear that there was so much still untouched and unsaid. Fashion in their time was a business, and a designer's work was discussed through his or her clientele and the stores that sold it. Their private lives were still private. But what if you looked at their art, their works as art, looked into childhood and love lives as keys to inspiration, and saw design in terms of metaphor and poetics? The whole field opened up, astonishingly rich with new information. Graydon Carter left Vanity Fair in 2017, and in 2019, with the brilliant Alessandra Stanley of the New York Times, began Airmail, a weekly, online, international newsletter of culture and lifestyle, visually elegant as all things Graydon are, and lots of fun. In fact, in your totes is a copy of our latest print broadsheet. I edit the Arts and Tell report, which covers art exhibitions and performance around the world. When the opportunity to present a panel here at the Winter Show came to us at Airmail, I hardly needed a moment to think. Two colleagues, Patricia Mears and Ruth Peltison, both of whom have written for Airmail and happen to be dear friends, leapt to mind. In their fields of expertise, these women are deeply involved in the generational leaps I just described. And both of them are working on books that will come out in a year or 2 years. Because they are knee-deep in their subjects and still on the cusp of discovery, I thought it would be wonderful here at the Winter Show to get them talking. As a flashpoint for this panel, both Patricia and Ruth immediately sparked on the 1925 International Decorative Arts Exposition, which took place in Paris 100 years ago. Patricia Mears has worked as a fashion curator for 35 years. She is currently the deputy director of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where she has organized numerous provocative exhibitions and written accompanying books on subjects that include modern couture, menswear, American and Japanese fashion, as well as fashion's connections to expeditions in extreme climates, classical dance, which is its own extreme climate, and interiors. Patricia's most recent FIT exhibition was a show called Designing Women, Fashion Creators and Their Interiors, which has blossomed into a book of the very same title that is going to be published by Bloomsbury. It looks, for the first time, at the influence of female couturiers on a male-dominated field, interior design. Ruth Peltison is an author, editor, jewelry historian, and lecturer. She was with Abrams Publishing for 16 years, where she was senior editor, director of design and style books. She's worked on a wide variety of art books and has specialized in writing about jewelry. Ruth teaches at the Sotheby's Institute of Art. She created the David Webb Archives, and in association with Van Cleef and Arpels, helped launch L'École, School of Jewelry Arts in the US. Ruth's books on jewelry include her recent The Art of David Webb, Jewelry and Culture, which spins its own web of fascinating connections between David Webb and the art and architecture of many epochs. She also wrote Elizabeth Taylor, My Love Affair with Jewelry. Her two forthcoming books are Jewelry Beyond Beauty, The Power of Design, 1960 to 1979, Thames and Hudson, and The Jewelry Wardrobe from Rizzoli. And so we embark on our panel, which takes its title from Elsie de Wolfe, who said, "The cardinal virtue of all beauty is restraint." Patricia will speak first, Ruth will follow. I will ask a few questions after that, and then open the floor to your questions.
Thank you, Laura. Well, this is a wonderful project, and as you can imagine, there are so many women designers. I had to really limit it to about 30, and I cover a pretty wide period, starting in the late 19th century and going up to about 1975. And of the more than 30 designers and more than 200 interiors, I'm just going to give you a tiny glimpse of some of them, mostly from the interwar years in France. And I wanted to start here to show a few things. This is the work of Jean Dunand, and he did a portrait of a leading milliner from the time period, Madame Agnès Rittener. We don't spend a lot of time talking about hat makers in fashion history. It's a new field of study, but it's starting to expand. And one of the things that has been so helpful about research into interiors is how much work French specialists have done. And it's where I learned more about some of these designers than I have from fashion publications. That beautiful portrait is just one of many. Jean Dunand was very integrated in the fashion field. He did more than a dozen portraits of leading female couturiers, but she was his favorite. Madame Agnès, this is one of, I believe, 7 that he did of her. And you can see the portrait on the left-hand side, the black and white photograph. It's from 1928, and it's an interesting installation that took place at Lord and Taylor. And it was organized by a woman named Dorothy Shaver. She became more famous as a buyer of American fashion and was one of the first to promote American designers in the 1930s. But before that, she was a buyer of furniture. So she went to France for 6 months, and she worked with very important names like Émile Jacques Woolman and Dunand and brought their work to America, the first time Americans had ever seen it. And this just gives you some idea of how widespread the influence of design was. Although I'm focusing today on the interwar years, the phenomenon really began earlier. We have couturiers like Jeanne Paquin on the right, that's her couture house, and the Callot sisters. 3 of their designs are in the little black and white photograph on the left. These women were the first to really build extremely powerful and very profitable couture houses. Around 1900, Paquin had about 2,700 employees, and she had a house that was bigger than Worth and certainly turned higher profits. She was so wealthy that she had, at certain times, 9 magnificent homes throughout France. They included 18th century private homes, as well as new construction by architects such as Robert Mallet-Stevens and Louis Sue. On the left, the Callot sisters were considered even wealthier. And the sisters, the three of them who ran the house, had homes like a palace on the grounds of Versailles, belonging to the sister of Louis XVI. But the thing that I think is interesting is that Callot, I had found, may have had the first couture house to have a separate interior design division. I cannot pinpoint the date, but if it's correct, that would have predated Paul Poiret's groundbreaking Atelier Martin. Now, the idea of having interiors divisions was something I really wasn't that familiar with. It's common today, but I didn't realize how prevalent it was at that time. One of the most famous was a Lanvin Decoration, started by the great Jeanne Lanvin, one of the most important couturiers of the interwar years. And she had this company and had as its head Armand-Albert Rateau, one of the great Art Deco interior designers and architects. And one of their commissions was this beautiful jewel box theater, the Théâtre Danube. We see two things that are important. One is both of them aesthetically loved historic design and they loved opulence. This kind of goes against our idea of the sleek, modern Deco style. At the same time, she was a couturier whose interiors really reflected her fashions and vice versa. The use of the color blue was the symbolic color of the house. Lanvin blue was the most beloved color that she produced. And if you look carefully, you will see these stylized floral motifs. It's meant to be the Marguerite or the oxeye daisy, and it was inspired by her daughter, Marguerite Marie Blanche, who was the great love of her life. Lanvin also headed the committee, or co-chaired the committee that put on view fashion during the 1925 Decorative Arts Exposition. And of course, the interiors were done by Lanvin Decoration. So she got to pick who was in the event as well as what the spaces looked like. But I think one of the most important legacies that she left were rooms that came out of her own private home that were decorated by Rateau. Two of them, the bedroom that you see here in the bathroom, are actually on view in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in the Louvre. The thing that's so interesting, it's not only a rare existing example of a room from this time period, but they're rather sanitized. I love this photograph from 1967 because it really shows how filled with tchotchkes her house was. And it gives you some glimpse of the great art collection. She had a magnificent collection of Impressionist paintings. Now, on the flip side, aesthetically, was the work of people like Jean Dunand, who worked very closely with Madame Agnès, who we had seen earlier. This is very clearly the Art Moderne or Art Deco style. On the far left-hand side is a pochoir of a room he did for the 1925 Decorative Arts Exposition. And the entire room is lacquered, the walls, the furniture, everything, including that sort of stepped cove ceiling with inset lights. He used the exact same design for Madame Agnès' atelier, and it too was lacquered, as was her apartment. The spaces were small, but everyone always talked about how luminous and how beautiful they were. And fashion audiences would have understood this as well, because the drawing on the far right-hand side appeared in Harper's Bazaar, and that is Madame Agnès standing inside of her beautiful salon there, wearing a dress by fellow couturier Louise Boulanger. Now, another major influence at this time period was not just this beautiful opulent style or the modern style, but neoclassicism. And the most beautiful example of that was the largest couture house of the interwar years. It belonged to Madeleine Vionnet. She also had the largest workforce. She had 1,200 atelier workers who were housed in state-of-the-art rooms. They had HVAC systems, state-of-the-art lighting, but she reserved the most beautiful efforts for this place, this room called the Salon de Présentation, that the Americans nicknamed the Temple of Fashion. And there were several designers involved in it. Ferdinand Chanot, who did the beautiful ceiling, Taillat, the futurist artist who did some of the work, and Lalique, who did all the glass work. On the far left is a photograph by Baron de Meyer of a Vionnet design standing under an archway by Lalique, all made of glass. Now, interestingly, I discovered names I really knew almost nothing about, like Juliette Mathieu-Lévy. And I think one of the reasons she's been forgotten is because she was always referred to by the firm that she worked for, J. Suzanne Talbot, one of the leading millinery houses. She was probably the third owner of this firm. But for us in this case, what's so interesting is that she hired not a male decorator or a designer, but a woman, Eileen Gray. And I believe she was the first client of Gray's. And it allowed Eileen Gray to really expand her business after this. What's fascinating is to look at the sort of darkened space on the left. It was not quite what Eileen Gray wanted to do. Juliette Mathieu-Levy had an idea of doing an exotic, really rich and opulent room, dark a little bit like this one. But 10 years later, she changed her mind and she said, I want to clean up the space. So she kept some of the pieces that Gray had designed, some of the furniture pieces, but had the room painted in silvery white and had all the floors replaced with glass that was lit from below. And it was, in fact, called the Salon de Verre. And what all of this discovery really helped me do was reposition the importance of some of the couturiers. We all know Chanel, but in fact, these women had homes that were just as beautiful and really more progressive in some ways. And the last two slides are going to be two of the most important couturiers. We all know Elsa Schiaparelli and Coco Chanel, but I now see them in slightly a different way. We all think of Chanel as the great modernist. And then at the same time, we think of Schiaparelli as the great artist of fashion. But interestingly, they both employed the same design firms at certain points in their lives. One was Jean-Michel Franck, and the other was Maison Jansin, which I thought was such a bizarre combination. Jean-Michel Franck, we know, is the master of luxury, but also understatement. Jean Cocteau had a wonderful quip about him. He said, I had gone to visit this young man in his apartment, and he was so charming. It's such a pity that his apartment was robbed, meaning that all the furniture had been stolen or taken away. There was not a tchotchke to be found in it. And then to flip and go with Jansin, the venerated firm. This is where royalty went. This is where the real titans of industry. If you had money, you went to Jansin. They would do the architecture. They would build the interiors. They would make the furniture, and they would even sell you antiques. So literally a one-stop shop at the very highest level. Now, Schiaparelli, when she first went to Paris, didn't have money, befriended Jean-Michel Franck, and did some experimental smaller apartments. When she made it big, she bought one of the grand buildings that are around the Place Vendôme. This is number 1 Rue de la Paix, and I think the House of Schiaparelli is still there. The center slide shows what Jean-Michel Franck did. White carpet, white cotton curtains. He kind of, if you will, cleaned up the space. It was, before Schiaparelli bought it, the house of Cherouille, another of the great Belle Époque couturiers. And you can see how beautiful and opulent it was with the carpets and the other sort of rich decorations. But what I found interesting, I always wondered why Jean-Michel Franck didn't take out the beautiful gilded boiserie in the room. Why did he leave it? It was landmarked. The French already had laws that would not allow you to remove those 18th century elements, which I thought was so interesting. But what she did when she really had money to buy her own house is that she claimed to have worked a little bit with Jean-Michel Franck, but it was really Maison Jansin that went in and did the home. It was so opulent. She had tapestries everywhere. She had beautiful gilded crystal chandeliers. It was about as rich as it could be. So the true, I think, Schiaparelli came out thanks to that venerated firm. For me, the real thing that was interesting is how her rival, Schiaparelli and Chanel, were frenemies, as we know. And I always thought, oh, she must have had such a modern apartment. But think about it. We all know her apartment in the Rue Cambon above her couture house. And we know her suite at the Ritz. And there is quite a bit of opulence, the Coromandel screens and whatnot. But she would always have something like a modern suede sofa. I found this house. In the 1920s, she bought a private 18th century home and had Jansin redo it. Every single one of these rooms is more opulent than the next, and very clearly in the 18th century style. There's nary a modern element in it. So what this has helped me do is really rethink the interrelationship and the influence these women had. And Chanel did talk about how she dressed like a modernist and believed in that in terms of your fashions, but the home was something very different. And she talked about how the home was the real spirit of a person. So in some ways, she must have been thinking about the 18th century and perhaps in a way to, if you will, walk away from the poverty and upbringing of her lifestyle. So throughout even just this small period with just a handful of designers, we can see the incredible variety and as well as the incredible leadership these women had within the field of interiors. And it also taught me other things because I saw price tags on some things. They were rich. really rich. So it's not surprising that fashion designers who make it to the top today have followed in the footsteps of these great women.
Thank you, Patricia.
I have long taken the position that jewelry is art. Having been an art book editor for so many, many years, I started to feel that jewelry was another spoke of the art wheel. You know, there's jewelry, there's architecture, there's photography, film, fashion, etc. Fine art, of course. I realized that every time I was talking to someone about jewelry and they were thinking how many carats something was or what it sold for, which, by the way, I will mention, for me, it was always about art. How could I connect? How could I talk about jewelry as art? And I found that I couldn't do it any other way but think of it as art, because I keep connecting to other things I see. Firstly, of course, there's the strong relationship between jewelry and fashion, which we can really go on about. The other thing is that any jeweler who's great, just like any painter, sculptor who's great, is thinking big. They're digging deep into their soul, but they're thinking big. And Belperron is, to my mind, she is the epitome of the beauty of restraint when it comes to jewelry. B, I would say she is perhaps the greatest woman designer, jewelry designer ever. And if I were to take away gender, I would say she's certainly in the top 10 and maybe even top 5. But what I found so interesting about Belperron is here's a woman who's born 1900, a fortuitous time, if ever, and she is indeed a woman of her age. Now, that can't be said about everyone, but she is in lockstep with change. Her great line was, "My style is my signature." What does that mean? That means that if you are looking at a piece of Belperron jewelry and someone's asking $200,000 for it and it's not signed, tant pis, because it's Belperron. Because we know the archives have been assiduously researched and there are a number of people who validate her work. This is a cornucopia that you see here. And it's kind of says everything about Belperron. It draws on ancient motifs. It's her love of juicy stones, these cabochon emeralds, this hunk of a faceted yellow diamond, and then this cornucopia, this swirl, this bloomed gold, which she treated so that it would look like ancient gold. That, in a nutshell, is Belperron. So by the time she's 19, she gets hired by Maison René Boivin, which is one of the biggest independent jewelers in Paris, because you've already got the big guys. You've got Chaumet, Mauboussin, you've got Cartier, Van Cleef and Arpels. But Boivin is its own kind of god. However, René Boivin dies in 1917. His widow, Jeanne Boivin, takes over. By the way, her brother is Paul Poiret, so you can already start to connect dots. And then she hires Belperron at the age of 19, and she says, "I'd like you to sort of be a model maker and also just help us design." Belperron stays until 1932. In 32, she leaves. Now, just remember 1932, because we're going to come back to it in a few minutes when we talk about Jean Toussaint of Cartier. But what's really happening in this slide is I could stop right here and say, here's everything you need to know about Suzanne Belperron. She looked back to ancient forms. The spiral goes back to the Middle Ages, to the Bronze period. The carved rock crystal and diamond leaf at right is actually based on an Indonesian leaf pendant, which is in the Met, which you can see an example of. I mean, it is the same piece. It's extraordinary. That piece is 14th, 15th century. This, as we know, is 20th century. And then the tube bracelet, the one at the bottom there. So this was recently auctioned at Christie's, and I had a chance to see it because I gave a small talk on it. And all I can tell you is that the depth of that is roughly 4 inches. Roughly 4 inches. It is extraordinary. So what's happening is the following. Why is this textbook? Spirals. Go back to the Bronze Age. Other cultures, Javanese. She looks at African art. She looks at Asian art. And now geometry, modernism. Because where is the century going? It's going forward and it's going fast. I will say that the other thing that slays me about Belperron is the relationship, the really open courtship she has with fashion. This is Madame Grey, as everyone in this room knows. When Belperron is looking at Madame Grey, she's taking the same idea, the braids, like you see the braids at the top of the Belperron gown. Well, she does the same braiding in rock crystal in that cuff. Now, look at the 3 rings. The one at the bottom, which is carved rose quartz with this really big, nice ruby in the center. Well, I think it's so fun that Diana Vreeland, around the time that this was made, which is 1938 or so, Vreeland sees a drawing of it, and one of her famous why don't yous for Harper's Bazaar says, and why don't you wear a something something fur cape and attach a carved rose pink, a carved rose quartz flower to your, garment. Well, oh my God, more connecting of the dots. How fun is that? The ring in the center is my rosebud because I saw that ring in person about 30 years ago at a show, and it was at Primavera. And I went up to Audrey Friedman and she said, can I help you? And I said, oh, for God's sakes, I can't buy this thing, but if you don't mind talking to me about it, I'd be thrilled. I said, because to me, it just looks like a blue ice cream cone. I just couldn't be happier. And so she started to explain more and more to me about Belperron, and this is a tourbillon. And that really got me going. So what you really see happening here is another thing that these artist jewelers are doing. They really don't care about emeralds and sapphires and rubies. They're into hard stones, inexpensive stones. They're kind of taking a page from the Art Nouveau artists in that one regard. It's organic, but it's also very modern. It's very clean. Well, speaking of clean, here's Vionnet. Oh my God, could you just die? I mean, it's incredible, this honeycomb dress. Now, look at this cuff. 3 lines, 3 bands. It's a riff on the 1920s style of wearing multiple bangles. Now you can wear multiple bangles in one. Belperron starts making this circa 1935. She makes it into the 1950s. It was such a successful motif for her. But what I see happening also is if you had that cuff on, there's a lot of skin showing. That dress is also about absence and presence, right? I mean, it's a use of space, the absence of seeing. It's the difference between naked and nude. Naked is really not something I want anyone to see. Nude is sexy. This is nude. It's great looking. And I can just make one other point quickly. About jewelry, you have to see it in person to understand scale, to put it on, to see what happens when that cuff is on your wrist. I can tell you it's a revelation. Now, again, Pure Forms Vionnet. This is by the great Italian futurist that Patricia mentioned earlier. What also makes this so forward-looking? She's smoking, for goodness sakes. She's captured in this pochoir with a cigarette in her hand. I mean, how modern is that? I mean, today we'd say, well, how stupid is that? But then, how modern is that you've got a woman doing this? And again, it's these clean forms. Belperron was mad for blue for lots of good reasons, but again, we see this constant dialogue happening between designer of jewels, designer of cloth. And then, moving into blue, we have the Duchess, she of what has become known as Wallace blue. What's interesting, as the Duke commissions this just a couple months after he abdicates in December 1936. So now it is the Duke of Windsor commissioning this for his new love, the Duchess. What's interesting, this is 1937. Belperron has been on her own for only 5 years. Now you think about people in business for only 5 years. When I think of myself in business for 5 years, this was not happening to me. Do you know what I'm saying? This is extraordinary because she was already quite famous. This is one of the most extraordinary suites ever. It puts her on the map. Of course, it does a lot for the Duchess of Windsor too, but there was nothing that compared to this suite. And then you have Elsie de Wolfe and this great bib necklace. One other point about Belperron, things can look random, they aren't. They are wildly deliberate, wildly engineered, wildly architectural. What does that add up to? Very modern. It's confident design, everybody. She knew it was going to work. And so did Elsie de Wolfe, who owned it. Now, speaking of confidence, there is, of course, the great Diana Vreeland. The eye has to travel. Well, where does your eye go in that picture? I go straight to her arm candy. You know, I mean, this is an amazing cuff. This too was up for auction at Christie's in December, and I put that thing on. Now you see it looks like, you might think it's white gold or silver. The struts, as it were, on this cuff, nope, that's rock crystal. Yep. It's just hard to photograph rock crystal when you've got diamonds next to it. They just cancel each other out. But talk about sexy again. So you put that on, it's like those diamond plaques are floating on your wrist. That is modern. That is architecture as jewelry, right? That's pretty good. So Vreeland wears it, and you can see it's big. She had a little wrist because that thing is huge. Okay, this is just for fun to keep connecting all the society dots. This was owned by Dorothy Paley. Now, look for a second. These tumbled emeralds, they were called couronne or tiara because it looked a little bit like African tiaras that they had with just stones above the top, like a diadem with the stones sitting up. And then, because of course everybody knew everybody, Dorothy has her good friend Henri make this drawing. Isn't that great? So now we go to the cat lady, Jeanne Toussaint. And Toussaint is younger. What's interesting about her is that she comes into the house of Cartier in the 30s. By that time, Cartier has already become a little bit known for Panther. Georges Barbier is commissioned by one of the Cartier boys to make this pochoir with the black cat in 1914, the same year they first do a leopard watch. But then Toussaint, who loved the big cats, she'd spent time on safari in Africa. Her apartment was, like everybody's, littered with skins, as you saw in some of the slides that Patricia showed you. So now the Windsors go over to Toussaint Cartier, and they say, we've got this big hunky emerald. Would you make something for us? And most people don't know this. She makes the very first panther on a stone in this big hunky emerald. It's not a great emerald, everybody, but it's big. And it's the leopard. It looks great. And then a year later in 1949, she puts that leopard on a cashmere sapphire beach ball. And it's just enormous. It's about 152 carats or something. It's really stupendous. And then Toussaint makes a lot of things for the Windsors, the famous flamingo with these unbelievable calibre cut emeralds, rubies, and sapphires, not to mention the diamonds. The exoticism, the perfume in the air is unbelievable. Don't forget that you've got two major expos. In addition to 1925, you've got two colonial expos, 1922 in Marseille, 1931 in Paris. Everything from every culture is landing there, right? I mean, Paris is the landing pad for everything that's happening in art and culture. And then look at these amazing pieces that Toussaint makes. I mean, a palm tree. Here's a stretched out leopard, which is a bracelet. He wrapped around the wrists of people such as Barbara Hutton and Vanderbilts and Rockefellers. And then the fabulous bird of paradise, which by the way is about 7 inches long. I want you to think what 7 inches looks like. It's large. It's extraordinary. And then just to wrap it up for me quickly, I adore Sophie Taeuber-Arp. And I was gobsmacked at the exhibition in 21, 22 at MoMA. Why did I include her? She did not make jewelry. I thought of including Sonia Delaunay because she did make jewelry. But what I love is that all these women, the people that Patricia has been talking about, the women that I've mentioned briefly, they are doing so much in so many fields. They are multi-talented. There is no one more multi-talented than Sophie Taeuber-Arp, about whom the Times wrote when the show came on, you know, she could do everything and was underestimated because of it. Had she just been a painter, maybe she'd be almost as celebrated as her husband, Jean Arp. But because she did everything, she was like a dabbler, but not really. She was extraordinary. So look at this, take note of what's on the walls, because she's into geometry, she's into data, into abstraction. She makes these costumes that are seen on the stage that she then, more abstraction. Then look at the needlework. And she had it framed in this gold leaf. As an aside, I'm a hobby needleworker, and I just adapted a Sophie Taeuber-Arp for myself. But it's fun because modernism allows you to think you can be modern too. And her marionettes are to die, just to die. They're Dada-esque. It was, seeing these was an eye-opener. And just to say, she was also working on doing interior design. So that brings me full circle to Patricia. And I will say that when the three of us were hatching this idea, one thing we realized is we just were not just connecting the dots of friendships and professional interests, but connecting the dots of Paris after the Great War and on into the 30s and 40s.
Thank you, Ruth, so much. So I have a question for you. My first is, through history, France has constantly reasserted its position as a ruler of taste and style. That's what was going on when the whole country, Chanel accepted, got behind the launch of Christian Dior in the post-war year of 1947. After World War I, the 1925 International Decorative Arts Exposition was a similar gambit to get France back to the forefront of culture. Can your subjects be viewed through this particular prism of French dominance?
Remember that the luxury trades were very important to the French economy. I know certainly after World War II, fashion accounted for more than 5% of France's GDP. So this was very serious. And I think there was a lot at stake, the national sense of pride that they had about this. And I have with me today several of my colleagues, Dr. Valerie Steele, the world-famous fashion historian, Dr. Colleen Hill, and Raissa Bretagne. I think they will back all of this up as well, that as much as we love American design and we're really looking at things internationally, we always find ourselves going back to France. And I think Ruth illuminated a lot of this. You had great advances, but you always had quality behind all of this. And it's almost as if the entire nation viewed it this way, and certainly at that time. And also France politically was very open. You didn't need a visa to go to France, so it was attracting people from around the world. You could go and you could live inexpensively and really see this push both by the government and I think by individuals as well.
I think the other thing is that you have Louis XIV, the Sun King, who really creates the whole notion of luxury. And he forefronts fashion very quickly. He builds up the French coffers with diamonds. I mean, he's the one who has the Tavernier blue, the big hunky blue diamond, which is now in the Smithsonian. And so you have, from the time of Louis XIV, you've got France as the place where luxury is born. At Van Cleef and Arpels, where I was for a period, they love to talk about, their favorite phrase is savoir-faire. They're always talking about the artistry, the making of something. Luxury begins with materials makers who know how to craft and the excellence of the work. That is France for the longest time.
The move from Art Nouveau to Art Deco and modernism has an early embodiment in the savage 1932 rupture, The Rite of Spring. Stravinsky, Nijinsky, Roerich, the three of them attempting to reset art by going back to a primal baseline, pre-cultural, angular, and raw. They thought that ballet as a stand-in for society itself was too refined, decorative, and even decadent. Do your female designers connect with this philosophy in any way, that need for a close feeling to the earth?
I think we can see it in some ways. For me, the women represented a spectrum, and there was a great deal of difference. I don't think Lanvin thought she was really close to the earth that way. I don't think there was a rupture that way. Also remember that the mindset for them, although they were looking at this, and I think they were drawn to it, you could see with Juliette Mathieu-Lévy, certainly as a very active collector of African art. I think there was, Laura. But designers, by my experience, are also people who have their antenna up. They sense what's going on in the larger world. Let me say, in the case with most of these women, with very few exceptions also, they came from poverty. Very, very poor. Vionnet was raised in a slum. We know Chanel's story of poverty. I think if there was a pull towards this, even if it was emotional, the desire as a creator, it was also an underlying component. So I don't see them personally investing that much. It was, again, slightly at a distance as a collector, infusing maybe a few elements into their work, but I don't think they were as visceral the way the Ballet Russe was. That was a rupture. I don't feel it with fashion as much. Ruth, what do you think?
It sort of predates Belperron and Jean Toussaint in the sense that it's really the Art Nouveau, which is new art, which is the rupture from all the diamonds and the swags and the pearls and the Belle Epoque. So I think it predates. However, I think it makes possible for someone like a Belperron to go forward. She has an ability to look back ancient forms and make them feel modern. You couldn't have done that in the 19th century. You simply could not have done it.
I'm going to ask you both one last question before we open to the floor, and that is regarding your books. Is there one discovery you've made so far that's especially important or meaningful to you?
I think it was for me. Anybody who's read a fashion magazine knows that interiors are featured. Somebody's glamorous house is always there. Conversely, if you read nesting magazines, it's not uncommon for a fashion designer's home. So the two entities, and this has been going on for many decades, it predates World War I. I think what I didn't understand, and it didn't happen until the pandemic when I was stuck at home in my really ugly, rundown country house, that I needed something else to look at. So I said, not only reading fashion, let me buy some interiors books. And as I began to read them, I noticed a phenomenon which is not on view here, but in the United States and America in particular, there was the rise of the great lady decorator. We mentioned Elsie de Wolfe as one of the earliest. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Jean Paquin, the Callot sisters, Louise Charoui, Lucille, a number of these other cutting-edge couturiers were doing the same thing at the same time. So this is what started me on this quest. And after all of this research, I still don't have the answer. The two were blooming at the same time, but were they taking advantage of a changing social environment? Was it one or a set of environmental opportunities that presented themselves? And I don't have a clear, conclusive answer, but that's where the genesis for this particular project started for me. The pandemic and an ugly house. So.
No, I mean, I mentioned the Belperron Chalcedony ring, which really has always been a real talisman for me. But the book that I've been working on for so long, this Jewelry Beyond Beauty, 1960 to 79, is I know so many films from the period, I know so much fiction from the period. And then when I started looking at fashion, I thought, oh my God, all these things connect. And then I started looking at jewelry and I thought all that connects. And I think it was the whole spider web thing that just made me feel like this is really fun. And the more I started to see how Twiggy and the Beatles and Cardin and this one and that one and Andrew Grima and then David Webb, and they all start happening. They all start happening. And then the deeper I got into it, I realized, oh my gosh, there's Bjorn Wexstrom who did Princess Leia's necklace. That, Star Wars, you know, that happened in the period. So I think for me, it's been this constant, I mean, this is why I can't finish the darn thing, is because it's always this feeling of Shazam, would you look at that? And I'm just constantly elbowing the dog saying, would you look at this? Here's another great coincidence. But that's the beauty of research, isn't it? You all know that pleasure of finding something, of looking at something. And then I think, talked myself into a job at a jewelry dealer, Kentshire, when I was working on my first book, because I said, I've just got to be able to touch jewelry. How in the world can I write about it if I can't see it and touch it, as opposed to seeing it in little pictures? And so I did that, and that changed me completely. It's like watching probably someone drape a garment, you know, create a costume. So it's the act of looking, touching, seeing, and connecting.
Thank you so much. Yes.
When you mentioned that Van Cleef used to talk about savoir-faire, I thought about the fact that it feels to me that luxury today is not so much about savoir-faire. It feels like it's about bling. Despite the fact that the word bling probably didn't exist in the interwar years in Paris, I'm wondering if we were to transport ourselves back to that period, do either of you feel that we would have had a similar reaction? Because after all, many of these designers were doing somewhat radical things, even though today they're the epitome of elegance and refinement.
Good question.
I think one of the things that we haven't talked about, Ruth has actually mentioned it, is the role of the client and the fact that we're talking about a very small world. These designers all knew each other and had the same clients who were going to all of these same people. I think they were feeding off each other in a way that we don't today. I think social media and all this has diminished that greatly. When you have an environment of highly sophisticated people, this, I think, inspires and also refines. And we go back to the title that Ruth had brought up for today's talk. They were speaking and listening to one another, and people were buying fashion magazines, I'll use that as an example, as an educational tool. You didn't think you were just great because you had a cool Instagram account. You knew that somebody else was a style and certainly a technical leader. So I think, to go to your point, so much of it really does have to do with the milieu, the environment, and the fact that these people were interconnected and operating and wanting to operate at the very highest level. Ruth, I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I 100%, and also what a really smart question. I think luxury, I think this is why the luxury sector is hurting deeply and people are confused. I think it's why we're seeing the crazy rise of collaborations, right? It goes back to 2001, Vuitton and Murakami, let's say, with the handbags. It continues on with Nike and this, or, I mean, Pharrell Williams is now doing pearl necklaces for Tiffany. I mean, my goodness, you know, how things have changed.
And I listened to one of the security guards today. He said, back in 2001 or something when this started, he said, we'd get 600 people for the whole run of the show. He said, we'll get 600 people here in an afternoon. What are they here to look at? Antiques. They're here to look at historic objects. And I think there is a thirst for that. So going back again to your question.
A thirst for beauty.
This is for Patricia Mears. Of the images that you showed, are any of those interiors still intact outside of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs?
I didn't show you one, but Madeleine Vionnet's apartment, I think, is still extant. And I think, Valerie, you've actually visited it. It's one of the rare ones. Most of these buildings have been torn down. It's not just the rooms have been redecorated, sometimes the buildings themselves. What's interesting is that some of the Parisian couture houses are still extant. The interiors as they were are not there anymore, although they've kept a few things. If you go to Schiaparelli today, there is one Jean-Michel Franck piece. It is an enormous bronze cage, bird cage, and it's where the perfume salon was, so you can still go in there. I guess it was too hard to deconstruct and throw away, but very, very few of them. And in America, I was looking at a lot of the interwar couturiers working here. Some of the buildings are here, but almost all of them have been torn down, including an incredible one that Hattie Carnegie built. She actually had 18th century French panels and architectural elements imported into the United States, and it had a special couture house built. The building was razed to the ground, and they put one of those glass and steel structures up in its place. Yeah, here in New York.
My question is this. With the exception of some of the references to modernism, I'm not seeing a lot of restraint here. And I'm wondering if I'm missing something in terms of the beauty of restraint. I think I was expecting a little different of an exploration than the beauty of the ornament or decoration. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about where you see the restraint or maybe the taking away of excess or something in these
It's a very good
women's
question.
works.
Very good question. Ruth got the quote from Elsie de Wolfe, and what she was talking about is when she started decorating, and you look at her, say, the early commissions, which are 18th century influenced, they're not clean or modern, they're not Bauhausian by our standards, but she was coming out of the Victorian era where the rooms were very dark. This is an example. If you can imagine this room filled with tchotchkes and furniture, every square inch, patterned textiles. By the time you get to Art Nouveau, that was considered a sort of cleansing of the palette. So that was restraint by their standards, not by ours. And I did show Jean Dunand, that was considered very radical. Jean-Michel Franck was considered very radical. But it was never one particular style. There were many different ones. And even Vionnet, who was considered more of a minimalist, there's quite a lot of decoration in her, Temple of Fashion by what we think of today. It's not a white cube with, a concrete bench and then that's it. Yeah.
I think also you go back to these ancient forms like Belperron did. That is as clean as it gets. I mean, the spiral. You can see so many of those in the first galleries when you walk into the Met. You go on the right, you'll see a lot of the vitrines with torques and these round brooches and cuffs. So I think that these motifs, we saw the influence of Egyptian revival when the tomb is discovered in 1922, right? King Tut's tomb. So these archetypal forms are themselves so clean. So when you go back, if I were to go back again to Belperron, that spiral has diamonds and sapphires, my dear, but the shape is as clean as it gets. With Belperron in particular, well, you look at Toussaint's flamingo pin. She knew exactly what to do, when to stop. Laura and I were very close to Jeffrey Bean, but Mr. Bean used to always talk about what you'd leave off. When you'd learn, when you thought it was time to stop, you probably were already too late. And when you go back and you look at Bean, you just don't know how the hell you would have done it any other way. Belperron, for me, is the same thing. There are very few jewelers. You look at that bib necklace, Elsie de Wolfe, oh my God, her business partner, Bernard Hertz, would just say he just would scratch his head trying to make it work. It's a construction that is perfect. Sometimes perfection is restraint. It's knowing when to stop, for me.
Okay. Thank you both so much for